In the previous section of the podcast, we looked at how globalization spread goods and money around the world in the 20th century. But it wasn't just goods and money that globalization spread, it also spread ideas. And none of these ideas were more powerful than the idea of liberation, which is a major theme of the 20th century. And liberation, in short, means freedom from oppression. Communism gave workers and peasants the dream of liberation from capitalist oppression and exploitation. Nationalist movements in the developing world gave colonial peoples the dream of liberation from Western imperialism. Democracy movements gave people all over the world the dream of liberation from unfair authoritarian governments. So, by the 1960s, we see a handful of liberation movements from around the world. In the 1960s, there were multiple major historic liberation movements in the United States alone. One of these movements was the Civil Rights Movement, where African American and Hispanic American voters demanded to be treated as equals. And it's kind of shocking, but it wasn't until 1964 in the Civil Rights Act that African American people in the United States actually got political equality. Also in the 1960s, there is a counterculture movement led by young people. So some things you might associate with the counterculture movement, hippies, Woodstock, anti-materialism, the idea that all you need is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And this group vehemently protested America's military involvement in Vietnam, and in the 1960s the question of Vietnam is something that deeply divides the American people, split pretty evenly among those who supported it and those who were against it. We also see protest movements emerge in the communist world in the 1960s. In 1968 in Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, who was the leader of the Communist Party, tried to bring some reform to the communist system in Czechoslovakia. He tried to make it fair and tried to make it better for the people. He did this by trying to end censorship, by promoting democracy and free thought. And for the Czech people, this was a very optimistic time. So this period of reform in Czechoslovakia in 1968 is known as the Prague Spring. Ultimately, the Soviet Union decided that all these reforms were a bad thing. They could inspire people in the Soviet Union to make similar demands for reform, and they sent in the tanks to crush the reform movement. So we have the Soviet Union putting down democracy in Czechoslovakia. We have the United States putting down democracy in Vietnam. Both superpowers showing that they're willing to crush democracy in order to stop the spread of capitalism and communism. In China in 1968, if you remember from the podcast a few weeks back, we have a different kind of revolution. The Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution was endorsed by Mao, and it was waged against the Communist Party in China. And the revolution happened because Mao thought that the elite in the Communist Party were veering too far away from the principles of communism. So this revolution is best understood as an extension of Mao's philosophy of permanent revolution. In any move towards communism, there'll always be elements that pull the country back towards elitism. So you cannot become complacent, you have to continue to fight elitism. In poorer countries in the developing world, political leaders and activists and students also developed the concept of a third world movement. And the third world movement emerged in developing countries that had recently freed themselves from colonial rule, and activists in these countries were hoping that their new independent countries would be an alternative to the capitalist world led by the United States and the communist world led by the Soviet Union. Hence the name the Third World. The central idea of the Third World movement was to create a viable alternative that focused on economic development that doesn't exploit people or destroy the environment, focus on democracy, and focus on a renewal of traditional cultures. By the late 1960s, the icon of the Third World movement was Che Guevara. Guevara was a revolutionary from Argentina. He played a role in the Cuban Revolution along with Fidel Castro, and he tried to replicate the Cuban Revolution throughout Latin America and Africa before being captured and executed by the Bolivian military in 1967. And finally, we have the emergence of global feminism. And this is an extremely significant liberation movement because it really asks people to re-examine the most fundamental and personal of all human relationships, and that's the relationship between a man and a woman. Feminism wasn't new per se in the 1960s. Feminism gained a lot of steam in the 1800s and had become popular in developing countries by the outbreak of World War I. But the 20th century really witnessed the globalization of the feminist movement in order to address issues affecting women across the globe. The first wave of organized feminism was mostly centered around getting women the right to vote. By the end of the 1920s, the feminist movement had mostly died out because in the developing world, women did get the right to vote. In the 1950s and 60s, a second wave of feminism emerged in the United States and North America and Europe. The second wave of feminism is closely connected with the publication of two books. The first of these is The Second Sex. It was published in France in 1949, written by French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. The central idea of the second sex is that women had always been defined as other, or deviating from the male sex, which was the normal sex. There was a lot of emphasis placed on giving women control of their own bodies. The second influential book is called The Feminine Mystique by American writer Betty Friedan. And this became extremely influential, especially in the United States. The central idea of the feminine mystique is that the current family work model, where husbands went to work and women stayed at home and raised family, that this setup was really unfulfilling for women. Women shouldn't feel that they have to be homemakers. Women can be whatever they want to be. So second wave feminist movements in the developing world really placed an emphasis on reproductive rights, better rights in terms of education, and better rights in terms of employment, and empowering women to take on professions that they want to do. In the second half of the 20th century, roughly corresponding with this second wave feminism in the developed world, we have the emergence of a feminist movement in the developing world. And the predominant issues in the developing world at the time were things like overcoming colonialism and racism that went along with it, and trying to become an independent nation. And these things weren't directly related to gender. So women often lent support to independence movements in the developing world, and women were always welcomed into the fold by nationalist leaders or communist leaders in these nations that were striving for independence. But once independence was achieved, the concerns of women were usually brushed aside by the new independent governments. So, in response to this, the fact that women played a role in the independence movements and then were largely relegated to marginal positions after the independence movements, we see the rise of feminism in the developing world. And feminism in the developing world was different than feminism in the developed world because women in the developing world had different concerns than women in the developed world. And they were actually very critical of Western feminism or feminism in the developed world for two major reasons. The first reason was that the feminists in the developing world thought that the feminists, or the brand of feminism in the developed world, was too individualistic. It wasn't concerned with issues of motherhood and community to be a practical system in the developing world. The second criticism is that they resented Western feminists' views on cultural practices. So things like polygamy, for example. A feminist from the developed world coming to the developing world, looking around and criticizing cultural practices and saying that they're wrong and that they're oppressive and that they need to stop them. It rubbed feminists in the developing world the wrong way and reminded them a little too much of missionaries or colonial rulers coming from the outside and telling them what's right and what's wrong. So really, feminists in the developing world wanted to choose their own battles to fight, wanted to decide what issues they were going to fight for. The biggest achievement of feminism in the 20th century was that it was able to gain international recognition that women's rights are human rights. In 1975, under pressure from feminists from around the world, the United Nations declared that 1975 would be International Women's Year and that the next 10 years would be the Decade of Women. By 2006, 183 countries have ratified the United Nations Convention to eliminate discrimination against women. This included giving legal equality to women, encouraging women's development, and protecting women's human rights. So I just want to give a brief overview of some of the issues of feminism in the world today, because it still remains a very divisive issue. The first issue is who has the right to speak on behalf of women. Specifically, who has the right to speak on behalf of women at women's conferences put on by the United Nations. At UN conventions, countries typically appoint female delegates to speak on behalf of women in their country, but women's movements in these countries will take issue with this because they're not the leaders of the women's movement in the country, the people that the governments are appointing to speak on behalf of women. So that's a question that we ask: who has the right to speak on behalf of women? The second issue are tensions between feminism in the developing world and feminism in the developed world. Women in the developing world have different needs than women in the developed world. So, for example, at a United Nations conference in Mexico in 1975, feminists from the United States wanted to limit the focus of the discussion to extending civil rights to women around the world, whereas feminists from third world and communist countries wanted to talk about other issues, including economic justice and decolonization, disarmament, issues that concerned everybody, not just women. There are also disagreements among the feminist movements in the developing world. And these disagreements came to a head at the Beijing Conference, United Nations Conference in Beijing in 1995. One of the items on the agenda called for equal inheritance rights for women. So basically, women should have the same inheritance rights as men. Muslim feminists took issue with this because Islamic law requires that sons receive twice the amount of inheritance as daughters. African feminists from non-Muslim countries felt that equal inheritance was extremely important going forward, especially with a lot of children in their countries orphaned. And finally, there's a tension between feminism and tradition, and there has been a global backlash against feminism by people who feel that feminism has undermined family life, undermined the proper relationship between men and women, and undermined civilization generally. And this backlash comes from all over, not just one religion or belief system. Within Islam, many people find Western-style feminism with claims of gender equality and open sexuality to be offensive, and this has spurred on religious revival movements that compelled women to return to wearing the veil and to wear modest dress. But the Catholic world also takes strong offense to elements of feminism, especially the notion of reproductive rights, the idea that women should have control of their bodies, specifically access to abortion and birth control.